Well, hello. It's very nice to be here. It's a pleasure to be at Solar, and thank you to Mats for inviting me. I'm going to talk about some work that is ongoing, so this is a work in progress, so please take that on board with your criticisms, which I'm sure many want to be finished. And I want to talk about some work that we're doing with Mats and also some other colleagues, Steve Fraser from Steubenville in America, and Kyle, who's a colleague of mine in RGU. And we're looking at explainability and the implications of explainability in generative AI. In terms of the talk today, it's mainly about some of the philosophical implications of generative AI around explainability that I think that we're going to need to deal with over the next however many years. So the plan is to first of all just talk about reactions to AI over the past year, because it seems the world's gone crazy, and then talk about what the philosophical bit is in the title. And then I'm going to talk about decision making and the role of explanation and learning and things. And I don't know if you've ever seen the Far Side cartoon where there's loads and loads of stuff on one side of the blackboard, loads and loads of stuff on the other side of the blackboard, and in the middle bit it's got, and then a miracle happens and that joins them. I don't have that miracle, unfortunately, so I've got kind of two disjoint things, and part of the reason that I really wanted to come here and talk to people is that I'm hoping that I can find the connection between the two bits that I am talking about, which is the human aspect of explanation and the explainable AI aspect of explanation. And then I'll kind of talk about vague implications for pedagogy and engineering and computing and subjects like that. But it'll be very hand-waving, so please take it with a pinch of salt. I spent far too much time on this slide. It seems like I spent more time looking at this slide and kind of moving things around than the entire rest of the talk. So take this away. It seems that the world has gone crazy over the past year in terms of generative AI. Certainly this time last year, someone mentioned to me this newfangled thing called ChatGTP and how it was going to make us all redundant, and how the students weren't going to have to learn programming anymore. And as a teacher of first-year programming, I kind of dismissed that and then started investigating it and threw up my hands in horror at what I found, because it means I'm going to have to change what I do. And I'm hoping that that some of the talks later on will help me understand what I need to do to help my students deal with the challenges that we face. But there has been a set of reactions to AI over the past years, and I'm sure you can find colleagues, or you can think of maybe yourself, who are on this diagram somewhere in terms of hostility to AI and the kind of Dune-like Butlerian jihad approach to AI. Any of the Frank Herbert fans here, where you just want to destroy everything which is remotely associated with AI. As I say, for the Frank Herbert fans, I think the first law in the Orange Catholic Bible is "Thou shalt not make a machine in the image of man." So that's an extreme, and then I can't find any reference to AI in The Expanse, which is undoubtedly the best science fiction in the last 30 years. Without a doubt, I'm not brooking any antagonism on that, but there's lots of reactions to AI, and I think that part of it is it's seen as a threat, and part of it is that but certainly for myself, I don't know enough about it. I don't know what the implications are. And I've spent the last year trying to find out from people who do know more than me what it's going to mean to me. Talking about the philosophical bit, I put this in because my daughter's doing a degree in philosophy, and she hates this particular slide. But I think there are philosophical implications for AI in education, and I think that it has to do with how we define philosophical, how we define the word philosophical, and to me, it indicates that the work falls under a number of different categories, the traditional categories of philosophy. So things like, what's the nature of reality? What can we know? What can we value? And especially the last of those, the axiological aspects of what we
that's the human AI.
Yeah, that's sure. And I think that there are ethical aspects which are going to impact upon us. And I want to start off this talk, although I'm 6 minutes in, by just talking about something which isn't about education, but it is something that you almost certainly would have heard of. And it's about the process of decision-making using AI. And so a really interesting paper is a paper by a lawyer, I think, called Beckman, who gave a talk at Chalmers a couple of months ago now, which was really interesting. I'd encourage people to listen to it if they can. And he was talking about the role of decision-making in public policy. And he talked about in order to have democratic legitimacy, decision-making should conform to what he called the principle of publicity. And the principle of publicity was that you should give reasons for decisions. So you need to connect the decision with some feature of the world, whether it's the legal aspects or the relevant facts or whatever. And it should be accessible. In other words, the reasons should be available directly to the affected party. And that this was significantly challenged by the use of AI in decision-making processes, because, as we're all aware, large language models, for example, are typically opaque in the nature of the technology. You can't interrogate them, you can't query the substrate in order to find out the process of the final decisions. And this has real ramifications. So it has ramifications in terms of GDPR, for example. The GDPR, I mean, I appreciate the irony of a citizen of the UK standing up here and talking about European Union regulations, but we've got it as well. So GDPR is an aspect of decision-making throughout Europe, and it stipulates that meaningful information about the logic involved should be available to the consumers, the people involved. Swedish law, I managed to find, a decision that can be expected to affect a person in a non-marginal way should include a clear justification unless clearly unnecessary. And I'm sure that policymakers can extend that definition of clearly unnecessary as far as they like. But nevertheless, there is a sense in which, in the public decision process, public policy making, decision making should be transparent. And as we move towards a system in which AI is increasingly seen as a reliable tool in which you can base decisions, on which you can base processes of decision-making and explanation, then this becomes a little bit problematic. And I think the same thing is going to happen in education. If you take away the context of public decision-making and substitute that with educational decisions, especially when we start using it to mark, and we start using it to grade, and we start using it to set assignments, and we start using it to give students feedback on their decision, on their work, then the students are inevitably going to turn around and say, well, why did you give me that F, or why did you give me that D, or whatever? And there is a disjuncture between the human side of, say, grading and assessing in general, and the process by which we delegate that to technology. And I find that really fascinating. I find it fascinating because I think there's an inevitability about I was going to say the encroachment, I don't mean the encroachment, but the move towards using this type of technology in a professional manner within the educational system. And it will be interesting to see what happens. Learning is incredibly tied up with the idea of explanation. So, from a pedagogical view, explanation lies at the very heart of many of the models that we've got about how we do the job, how we do how we educate people. We ask students to demonstrate competence in conceptual understanding using explanations. And we know what we mean when we say that. We mean a type of procedural aspect, an aspect of procedurality, if you like, which is inherent in the process of demonstration. And that procedurality is something which doesn't sit well with the use of, for example, large language models or opaque AI in general. So there's a real challenge there, I think, in terms of, as I say, on the one hand, there's I think the inevitability of using these tools more and more in the educational process, but also the desire to provide export or to rely on explanation, as we have done in the past, in order to allow students to demonstrate competence. Just as an aside, and to kind of show my due diligence with the philosophical aspects of this, there are a number of ways of talking about explainability when we talk about human explainability. So leaving aside the artificial intelligence stuff, the most interesting, I think, partly because it's got some good stories behind it, is the constructive empiricism aspects, where explainable information provides answers to what they call contrastive why questions. So I'm just throwing this up there, but that's an interesting thing. That's an interesting thing. So explanations are counterfactual, according to this theory, anyway. And I found it quite believable. So explanations are counterfactual. We don't ask why something happens, because the layer of causes and the ladder of causes would reach back to the Big Bang or whatever. So we hardly ever ask, why does this happen? Or at least if we do, what we really mean is, why does something happen rather than something else? And that, from an educational perspective, is really important, because it narrows down the scope and the context in which you need to deal. So a student, for example, only needs to narrow if you ask them, why does this if statement work like this? They only have to narrow down the context of the answer to quite a relatively small area of their knowledge. They don't have to encompass explanations which involve, the history of programming languages all the way back to Alan Turing or whatever. So a contrastive explanation is really quite important when it comes to what we do as educators, I think. And there's other types of counterfactual explanation that we use. So bifactual explanations. Why does P happen when sometimes Q happens? These are other explanations as well. These types of explanations don't really have a well-defined counterpart when it comes to explainable AI. So explainable AI is the art and science of trying to get artificial intelligence to develop some kind of explainability criteria, and I'll talk about the explainability criteria in a little while. But it doesn't respond very well, at least in my understanding of the literature. It doesn't respond very well to contrastive explanations and counterfactual explanations. And partly of that's due to the technical nature of things like neural network technologies, and partly because actually these are quite subtle and quite important philosophical aspects of what it means to explain something to someone else. Just in terms of competency theory, which is the I don't know, quite rightly, I think, the assessment theory du jour, this has an important implication. In competency theory, you've got your knowledge and you've got your skills and you've got your dispositions, and you may have a little bit of intersection between the two. That intersection there is actually quite controverted, I think, but nevertheless, you've got this aspect of building up curricula in terms of competency theories and developing competencies. But in order to demonstrate knowledge, we rely on explanation. In order to demonstrate skills, I think we necessarily rely upon demonstrability. We ask people to do things in a procedural way. And again, that's challenged by the non-transparent nature of, for example, neural net architectures. So again, the technology is going to have a significant impact upon the way that we operate and the way that we think about learning and the way that we relate basic philosophical ideas about learning, about education, to the practical ideas of teaching. So that's kind of one half of the talk. And as I say, then I would like to announce a miracle which would allow me to segue really nicely and easily into the next part, which is about explainable AI and talking about some of the ideas that arise there. But I don't have that yet. I don't, as I say, this is a work in progress, and I get to chat with Matt once a week for an hour, and he hasn't made it the last couple of weeks. Otherwise, I would have had this off pat. But I mean, I think it's an issue. And as I say, one of the things I'll be doing throughout the rest of the day is pestering people about what they think about the linkage between human explainability, the philosophical aspects that I've kind of talked about, and the technical aspects of AI and explainability there. Just to talk about contrastive explanations one bit, because there's a really nice story which everyone quotes, so you would have heard it before, but nevertheless, I think it's quite pertinent. There was an American bank robber. I can't remember his name. He was an American bank robber, and they asked him why he robbed banks, and he said, "That's where the money is." And that's an example of a contrastive explanation. The questioner undoubtedly asked, why do you rob banks? And the contrastive class that was contrasting with that question was things like, as opposed to be a productive member of society. But clearly the person understood that as, why do you rob banks as opposed to rob, I don't know, kindergartens or I don't know, town halls or things like that. So contrastive explanations are interesting in themselves, I think. As I say, the second part of the talk is really about, does this really matter? So this is a nice typology of interaction with technology that I found in this paper by Lodge and his co-workers. And he was talking about responding to the challenge that ChatGPT, for example, large language models are really just like calculators. We've been there before in the 1970s, those of us who remember the 1970s. We got calculators and suddenly we didn't have to do arithmetic anymore. And actually, that was quite a bad thing, as I recall. Being my first training was as a maths teacher, and the unremitting delegation of calculation or arithmetic calculation to calculators and that kind of technology, I think proved remarkably bad for students in those areas. And so the reason I like this is it talks about offloading, cognitive offloading, and the calculators do that. Calculators just offload the task of doing arithmetic to the technology. You know, if you want to multiply 387 by 942, you punch it in your calculator. Back in the day, we may have used a slide rule, and I still have some slide rules at home, but nobody uses those now. I remember I was in the last class in my secondary school who learned how to use a slide rule before we all got given calculators. That's just a comment on how old I am, really. But I think that kind of cognitive offloading would be a great shame if we allowed the technology of generative AI to just be partitioned into that particular quadrant. I think that the technology itself has immense promises in terms of what we can do and what we can allow students to do, where the starting point for learning arises. And I don't need to tell you all that, because you'll let expert teachers and things. But clearly, we need to do better than to just parcel off ChatGPT as a kind of upstage calculator. The Lodge and his co-authors see it as a hybrid technology, which can both allow engagement in collaborative work and extend the nature of the educational process for students. And I think that that's quite a nice vision of where the technology should go. How to do it, of course, is another thing, and there are some aspects I think that we can see, but certainly in terms of where this is going, I think that particular quadrant there, the hybrid quadrant, where we're extending students and allowing much greater collaborative effort, is something that we should strive for. I've got some technical definitions there, so I'm not going to. They're there on the slide. I don't really have enough time to say this, so I apologise for that. But I'm just going to go on to perhaps the last slide, or the second last slide, and implications for education. And these are just personal implications, or personal views about the implications, in conjunction with talking to Mats and Steve and Kyle and people like that. So, firstly, explainability is going to be an increasing problem in an educational setting, I think. I don't think it's going to be a bad thing, but it's going to be a challenge. It's going to be a problem that we need to engage with. Understanding what explanation means with the rise of this kind of technology is going to require some hard work. And it's not just going to be empirical work. One of the reasons that philosophical really does belong in the title is that much of the work involved in looking at these processes, these kinds of ideas, involve conceptual analysis rather than just the empirical scientific approach, which is clearly important, but I think that it's just an impression I get, and I may be wrong, but I think that with the inevitable rise of the computing education research community and the maturation of that in terms of seeing it as a bona fide research area, we've needed to concentrate on data collection, building scientific models. But to a certain extent, I feel that we've left out the conceptual analysis of some of the basic terms that we address. So things like skill, things like knowledge, things like disposition, which form the basis of context even, which form the basis of some of the ideas about competency that we use, but are not really wholly amenable to empirical investigation. And I think that kind of conceptual clarity that philosophical investigation brings is going to be really important in terms of what we do in the future. What else? I think that we need to embrace a holistic systems development approach to competence, which sees that kind of procedurality of explanation as just one part in a bigger system. So, you know, anybody who teaches basic software engineering or software design or whatever knows that you've got the software development life cycle, and it starts off, and you've got the planning stage, then you've got the requirements analysis, and then you've got the project specification, and then you've got the design phase, and then you've got the implementation phase, and then you've got the testing phase, and then you've got the maintenance phase. You can see I've been doing this for a while. And you go round, and it comes as a great shock to students to see that coding is actually just one part of that whole enterprise. And I think that we will see the implementation aspects of computer science being just one part of a much greater whole as we develop, and as we offload to a certain extent the processes of the developing technology, software technology to machines. We need to pay attention to declarative skills. Skills of specification, I think, are going to be increasingly important, and I don't know how to teach them well to my students. So again, I think that that's a real issue. I mean, I can teach them okay in terms of software development, but the wider aspects of teaching specification skills to students, and I hope that Matt is going to talk about this in terms of what else is there apart from programming and computing, because I think that's very important. I think that's, you want to stop?
Just for those who are not familiar with the term specification skills, I'm not in computer science.
Oh, right. I mean, how you formally specify a project so that someone else can take it and build the thing. So how to specify in terms of the requirements analysis that you've got. But, sorry, I thought you were just telling me to shut up now because my time's finished. What else? I think that these declarative skills, specification, tie in very nicely to ideas which certainly me and Mats and Steve have been having about deliberative and evaluative judgment, going all the way back to Aristotle and the idea of phronesis. So I think that those, we're going to see a renaissance in some quite old ideas about judgment and about evaluation. But I do think we need to pay attention to the democratic deficit, or the educational equivalence of the democratic deficit when it comes to us using the tools and us not being able to explain to students what they're doing. So I have 2 minutes according to this. So the last slide is really back to philosophy. In terms of computer science, we've often been looking at this kind of area, talking about methodology, talking about the logical aspects of epistemology, and in terms of knowledge building. I think as we go on, and especially in terms of these new technologies, we're increasingly going to have to talk about the axiological aspects of the technology. That's quite difficult for me, because I've been brought up from a philosophical sense anyway, in a kind of Anglophone analytic tradition, very much based upon philosophy of language and philosophy of mind and things like that. There is another tradition, the continental tradition, should we call it, which is much more concerned with the reality, the lived reality of dealing with technology. And I think that that's going to become increasingly important as we go on. But I do think that the ethics of these technologies, and also the aesthetics of these technologies, what it means to be proficient, what it means to have virtuosity in an environment where you distribute or delegate task to machines, I think is going to be another interesting question. So I don't have any answers. I'm just, as I say, extremely conscious stuff. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Roger.